everyone, welcome. We're going to wait 30 seconds just for others to join. I know we have a number of participants joining us today. Over 100, it's great news. So I think we've got 25 in the room now. We're going to wait for others to join. My name's Chris Bayliss. I'm Director of Standards with the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, and it's my great pleasure today to host this latest in our series of 45 minutes on, which is with Science-Based Targets Initiative to talk about their new net zero standard. I'm joined today by Amelie Tan, Regional Lead for Carbon Disclosure Project's Commit to Action Programme in Asia and Oceania regions, and also Emma Watson, Senior Net Zero Manager with the Carbon Disclosure Project, who she's leading the development of this corporate net zero standard. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, it's a global body. Many of you will have heard it. I think many of our members are members of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's a global body enabling business to set ambitious emissions reduction targets in line with the latest climate science. It's a collaboration between Carbon Disclosure Project, the United Nations Global Compact, World Resources Institute, who are behind the GHG protocol, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, members of ASI. And it's focused on halving emissions before 2030 and achievement of net zero emissions before 2050. The science for limiting global climate change to below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The SBTi has recently launched a corporate net zero standard, which is the world's first framework for corporate net zero target setting in line with that climate science. And we're looking within ASI to incorporate those kind of standards, those kind of tools in upcoming changes to our standard guidance. So we're working very closely with Science-Based Targets Initiative, and it's my great pleasure today to have with me Amelie and Emma. What we're going to do is we'll have a presentation from SBTi, and then we'll go into Q&A. And I do encourage you to use the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen down there, to ask your questions throughout. And then at the end, we'll collate those and have a great Q&A session. With that, I'm going to hand over to Amelie and Emma to take us through the presentation and to thank you once again for participating in this 45 minutes on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And once again, hi, everyone. I'm Amelie. I'm based in Hong Kong, and I lead engagement for the Asia and Oceania regions. Let me just move the slide. So today's agenda, just to quickly go over, I'm going to go through an introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative and also a bit on our net zero commitment for the business ambition for 1.5 degrees. And then Emma will go through the net zero standard development process and also what is, really a science-based net zero target. And finally, I will go through, the near-term and net zero target setting process to kind of let you understand what that looks like. And today, for this session, it's Emma and myself who were presenting. And for the second session later today, it will be our colleague in North America, Paulina, who will share the presentation with the rest of your colleagues. So onwards to the introduction. So for those of you who are not yet familiar with the Science-Based Targets Initiative or SBTi, we started in 2015, and it's a collaboration between the 4 organizations, as Chris mentioned. And it's also one of 12 low carbon initiatives for the Women Business Coalition. And so, the Science-Based Targets Initiative has been growing quite strongly. And, up till now, we have more than 2,000 companies that have joined us. So we are quickly gaining momentum, and that's really good to see. Speaking of momentum and also some progress, we see that companies with science-based targets are decarbonizing at a faster pace than their peers. Based on our progress report, we see that, there is a reduction of 25% of emissions between when we started to 2020. And this was during a period when there was an overall 3.4% of global emissions from the energy and industrial processes. And a typical SBTi company, has been shown to reduce their emissions at a linear annual rate of 6.4%, which exceeds the rate that is required by our criteria to keep warming at 1.5, which is at 4.2%. So this is really good traction. And it also shows that, having a science-based target is effective for companies to make that transition to low carbon. So what does the process look like, on the SBTi journey? So the first step is to commit by signing a commitment letter. So this will be a public commitment to signal to your stakeholders that you are planning to set your targets with the SBTi. So after you have committed, typically a company will have 24 months to get your targets validated. And during this time, we have resources provided for you, as well as, webinars that you can watch, and during these 24 months, you can submit your targets to the SBTi to get it validated. And then once it's validated, you will have to disclose on the progress towards your target each year to make sure that it is, communicated in a public manner. And, at least once every 5 years, we also ask companies to re-look at your targets to make sure that it stays relevant to your company. And there are some, if a company has a big change, like a major change to your company structure, it may trigger, a revalidation as well. So this is what the commitment letter looks like as a first step. It is a very straightforward process. You fill in the letter, get it signed off. And if you tick the box for net zero, then it will also put you into the business ambition campaign that is part of UNFCCC's Race to Zero. And we will do a quick due diligence. And once it's passed, then we will put it on the SBTi website. And you can make your announcement for the commitment. And here I will hand over to Emma to take you through the net zero standard development process. Emma?
Thank you, Emily. Great. Thank you all for having us today. So yeah, I will take you through the net zero standard development process to start off. So I guess, first of all, looking at the science on a very high level. So at the moment, we are in a state of imbalance between the greenhouse gases that humans are emitting and the CO2 removals that we are implementing. So this imbalance has led to climate change. And really what we want to get to is a state where the greenhouse gases that we're emitting is significantly reduced. So you can see that on the right-hand side of the screen. And then balance with CO2 removals. So essentially, I mean, at a very, very high level, this is the picture that we're trying to solve through the net zero standard process, trying to understand how we can translate this global picture into something that companies can implement themselves. So when we're looking at this situation, we essentially have to, we're aiming for a goal of limiting warming to 1.5C within the Science-Based Targets Initiative and within the wider climate change agenda. So we need to reach this state by no later than 2050. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Emily. And really, the kind of momentum around net zero began when the IPCC released its special report on 1.5 degrees of global warming. So that was back in October of 2018. And that was when the concept of net zero came to the forefront. And since then, there's been a huge uptake in the growth of adoption of net zero targets. So what you can see on this slide on the left is that there is a coverage of global emissions of 88% and of GDP 90%. So this data is from November last year, and it comes from the Energy and Carbon Intelligence Unit. So they have this net zero tracker, which tracks all net zero commitments. It doesn't necessarily kind of get rid of those targets that aren't credible. It's just a whole list of all of the commitments. We also see through the UNFCCC Race to Zero campaign. So Emily mentioned that earlier. It's an umbrella campaign that includes lots of different actors, so companies as well as different types of organizations like cities, regions, hospitals, that type of thing. There's absolutely everything within that. So this graph shows that from June till September, there was a huge increase in the commitments to race to zero, even grew more than that after this. And what you can see within this graph is that the largest portion of the commitments were actually coming from companies. So that's the kind of light purple block within there. So there's been a huge increase in net zero commitments since 2018. However, if we go on to the next slide, please. What we're seeing is that although there's been a huge rise in, this commitment towards net zero and ambition, there hasn't been a robust benchmark surrounding net zero. And that's led to a lot of criticism because companies are setting net zero targets in a whole variety of different ways. And you've probably seen in the press some of these criticisms of people looking at the different targets that companies are setting and pointing out differences and highly criticizing them. So some of the criticisms that we're seeing, and I won't go through in a huge amount of detail here, but I think probably the top two are that, first of all, they could lead to delayed action. So if a company is just purely setting a net zero by 2050 target, but there's no interim milestones behind it, how can we ensure that we need to, that company is going to contribute to the goal of halving emissions by 2030? How can we actually ensure that they're going to do anything about it? 2050 is really, really long time away. The other main criticism is that it allows companies to focus on offsetting rather than actually reducing their emissions themselves. So they could just buy offsets and be net zero if there's no framework that says that you actually have to reduce your emissions to comply and to actually have a credible net zero claim. So these are the things that we found to be different between targets and some of the common criticisms. And through the net zero standard development process, we were really trying to address some of these criticisms to make sure that the targets that companies were setting were really credible, aligned with the science, and that stakeholders could feel that they were robust. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So just very quickly, so this slide shows the timeline for the net zero standard development process. I've included a link within this slide, so if we share them afterwards, you can go to our website and see in much, much more detail about the development process. Essentially, it was a kind of over 2-year process, but really from a public-facing perspective, kicked off when we published our Net Zero Foundations paper in 2020. So that was a paper which outlines the foundations of the work. We'd done some research to kind of feed into that. And then after that, we set up an expert advisory group, which we were lucky enough to have Chris as part of. So that was a group of 42 experts from all different realms of the climate change space, from civil society, business, academia. So they've really helped us drive and steer the project. We, throughout the process, we had 2 public consultations, and we also went through a road testing process with 84 companies during the summer. So what I wanted to demonstrate with this slide, that it was a very, very kind of thorough and inclusive process. And throughout the whole of the development process, I calculated that we engaged over 800 stakeholders throughout the process. So it was a massive team effort, not just within the SBTi, but with many, many external stakeholders as well, to make sure that it was a really good standard, really robust and credible. So we launched that standards just before COP26 on 28th of October last year. Great. So just to dive a bit more into what a science-based net zero target is. So thinking back to that previous slide that I showed that had the global picture, and then that was essentially what we were trying to break down for a company to the company level. So the first key element of the net zero standard, or a target that aligns with the net zero standard, is to set near-term science-based targets. So these are, if you're familiar with science-based targets, this is what companies have been doing for the last 5 or so years. So these have now been reduced from a 5 to 15 timeframe to 5 to 10. And companies also have to align with the global warming scenarios of 1.5C. So previously, companies could align with well below 2C, kind of as per the Paris Agreement, but we've now ramped that ambition up as part of net zero. So that's the first element. And going back to the slide that talked about the criticisms, the near-term science-based targets really ensure that we have those milestones along the way to net zero to make sure that the right actions are taken in the short term. The second element is a long-term science-based target. So this is a new science-based target, and we developed these methodologies through the net zero standard development process. So essentially what this shows is it shows the company how much they need to reduce their emissions to be in line with the global scenarios that reach net zero by 2050 and align with 1.5C. So this, again, thinking back to that previous slide, there is a dramatic reduction in emissions that's required, and the same goes for companies as well. So for most companies outside of forest, land and agricultural sectors, they will be looking to reduce their emissions by 90% or more. So it really is getting to almost zero before companies are actually reaching net zero. And that's a big change in comparison to how many companies have approached net zero in the past. However, these levels of reductions are really necessary because the amount of capacity that we have for carbon removals is finite and actually quite small in comparison to the amount of emissions that we produce at the moment. So we really need to reduce our emissions as much as possible to then be able to balance them out and reach that state of net zero. If we go on to the next slide, please. So the third element is a recommendation and not a requirement. However, it is a strong recommendation that companies actually go beyond their science-based targets and think about how they can mitigate emissions outside of their own value chains. So if you think about, traditionally offsets, carbon credits, this is where this would sit. However, this is a much wider approach to beyond value chain mitigation. So, for example, a company might be financing projects towards a just transition. There's not necessarily kind of a ton for ton on that. However, they're really important for us as a society to get towards net zero. So it's more difficult to do that accounting, and this is very much a kind of work in progress of how we can better advise companies how to do that. But this is just a recommendation that companies do go beyond their science-based targets as long as they are already they already do have a plan in place to achieve the science-based targets. And just some examples, I mentioned, financing projects, but some other examples could be purchasing high-quality jurisdictional RED+ credits. So the LEAF Coalition is a good place to start if you're interested in that. And also investing in direct air capture and geological storage. So we recognize that that really needs to be scaled up. So another good one to point out. So finally, the fourth element of a company's target would be the commitment to neutralize any remaining emissions when the long-term science-based target is hit. So if we look at the image on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see where the blue diamond is. So the dark blue is then balanced out by the purple. So that's the state of reaching net zero, and that's when the emissions are neutralized. It's important to say that any carbon that is removed, it should also be permanently stored. We get lots of questions about, what is a permanent removal? How long would that be? And at the moment, the frameworks for understanding permanence of removals are quite immature, but it's a very fast moving space. So at the moment, we aren't specifying what those removals could be. We're just kind of pointing towards a variety. And whilst those frameworks become more mature, we can provide more criteria. However, what you will notice is that, with the 90% emission reduction requirement, it's unlikely that many companies are going to be able to achieve that in the near term. It's going to be kind of a further reaching, that's going to happen further in the future. And so we've got a bit of time to understand, what makes a really credible removal. Great. And so I mentioned a couple of times that the IPCC, this SBTi, has raised the bar. So the 1.5C targets are now going to be the new normal for science-based targets. So previously, we allowed companies to set targets aligned with well below 2 degrees for scope 1 and 2. That's been ramped up to 1.5. So this slide just shows, if you're familiar with the criteria, this just shows some changes. So the highlights are, as I mentioned, the ambition of scope 1 and 2 targets has increased, and the time frame has reduced from 5 to 15 to 5 to 10 years. And then for scope 3, the same goes for the time frame, and scope 3 targets have to be aligned with at least well below 2C rather than at least 2C. So just a kind of a ramp up in ambition for that as well. Great. And I guess it's important to say also that so these new criteria will apply for all companies from July of this year, mid-July. However, if you're looking to set a net zero target, you do have to comply with our new criteria to be able to have net zero targets validated. Okay, next slide, please. And then when companies, I guess, on a more practical level, when companies are looking to set their near and long-term science-based targets, there are 4 things that they need to take into account. So the first is the boundary of the target. So how much of your emissions in the inventory are required to be covered? So in the near term, we're looking to cover scope 1 and 2, 95%, and 67% of scope 3 emissions. In the long term, it's the same for scope 1 and 2, but for scope 3, it's 90%. So that's a jump in ambition of the coverage over the long term, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a second, because that has been identified by companies as really the key challenge towards long-term science-based targets. We've talked about the ambition already. So in the near term, targets have to align with 1.5C for scope 1 and 2, and well below 2C for scope 3. However, in the long term, to reach that kind of global net zero goal aligned with 1.5C, all scopes have to align with 1.5C as well. The time frame, so mentioned this already, 5 to 10 years for near-term science-based targets, and for long-term science-based targets, it's 2050 latest. The exception to that is the power sector, which is 2040, and we expect also that forestry will also have an earlier date as well. And then finally, the methods. So you can learn more about this in our Science-Based Targets corporate manual and our Getting Started guide. So I won't go into this in much detail at all, but just to point out that we do have 6 methods of target setting. The only difference between the near and long term is that supplier engagement targets aren't valid for long-term science-based targets. Saying that, if you're familiar with that method, it's very popular because it's very easy to track for scope 3 emissions, which can be a massive pain to gather all that data. So companies tend to like it. It's very impactful. We are starting a scope 3 project to follow on from the publication of the net zero standard, and the idea of that project is to look at a lot of things related to scope 3, but one of them is to explore further target setting methods that companies would be able to use that, may be similar to supplier engagement in that they are really easy to track, but have a lot of impact. So we're going to be thinking about those methods as well, and hopefully have some further options in the future for companies. Great. And if we go on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that we have increased the boundary for the near-term targets, so from the near-term targets to long-term targets. So in the near term, just to reiterate, it's 67% coverage of Scope 3 emissions, and in the long term, it's 90% coverage of Scope 3 emissions. So we have, we found through the development process that it was really, really necessary for companies to include their whole value chain of emissions within their net zero targets in order for them to be credible. And if we think about it, holistically, if a company isn't including its Scope 3 emissions within its net zero target, then it reaches net zero by 2050. And, the rest of its supply chain and customers haven't come along on that journey. It's pretty pointless, because that means that we've actually failed to achieve net zero as a society. So it's really important for everyone to come along in that journey and everyone to be part of it. And that's why such a large proportion of Scope 3 is included. However, we do recognize that there's a lot of challenges with Scope 3, data collation, tracking, et cetera. So we have provided this kind of expansive boundary approach that we call it, so that companies can focus on their biggest emission sources right now, and then they have time to work through the complexity, and hopefully, in 5, 10, 15 years, the data collation processes for Scope 3 will have improved massively, and we'll be able to start collecting that data in a much more efficient way. So fingers crossed that that will happen, and hopefully this will kind of spark some innovation within the field to be able to address this challenge as well. Great. And if we go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned already, touched on this already slightly, but we do have 3 follow-on projects to tackle the challenges related to net zero. So the first is a project around the beyond value chain mitigation piece. Bit of a mouthful, but thinking back to the third element of a company's net zero target, that's the bit, the above and beyond part of the science-based target. So we recognize that, we need to scale up in this area, but we need to also provide guidance to companies to how to do that. So that's the first project. The second is that Scope 3 project, so net zero value chains. I won't go into that again. And we're also conducting a measurement, reporting, and verification project. So that is really in response to the progress report that we published, that we've been publishing, and we'll publish another one. We do that annually. And essentially, it's for us to be able to start tracking progress and ensure accountability and transparency of targets going forward. So watch this space for those 3 projects. And then I guess just to kind of touch on some of the terminology, you may be familiar with the term compensation. That is a term that we used within the September 2020 Foundations paper, and we continue to use that throughout the project. However, what we found was that there was a lot of negative connotations towards the term compensation, and it didn't really do the job that we wanted it to do. So we've moved to this very catchy term, beyond value chain mitigation, and essentially we're trying to encompass everything. So what we're trying to show in this slide is, we have quite a few terms, mitigation being a catch-all umbrella term for any human intervention to reduce emissions or enhance sinks. So pretty much everything that we're doing within the climate change space is mitigation, or at least that's the goal. Then within the SBTi, we tend to distinguish between things that happen within the value chain, so within a company's own operations, supply chain, and customers, and then outside of that. So what you can see in the image is the abatement being within the value chain, so that's mitigation within the value chain, and then beyond value chain mitigation. So that's kind of how it sits. We also have the term neutralization, which was the fourth element of the infographic that we showed previously. And those are the kind of removals for companies to then balance out their remaining emissions. This can happen both within and beyond the value chain. So that's where that sits within the kind of wider picture. We do have a guide, a blog, which is a guide to our net zero jargon. There's a lot of jargon. So there's a link to that if you want to kind of read up on that in a bit more detail, because I understand it's a lot to take in. Great. And then just on to the mitigation hierarchy. So this is another term that we use. It's the central principle of the net zero standard. Basically, what it means is that a company should focus on their own targets and value chain emissions first, make sure that that's all in order, and then start to think about things beyond the value chain. So that's really addressing that, I suppose, tendency or criticism that companies would just offset their way out of, the problem and to reach net zero. Companies should really focus on their own, value chain first, and then if they can, go beyond that. So the question around carbon credits comes up a lot. What's the role for carbon credits? They don't replace a company's own emission reductions. However, they can play an important role. So first of all, in the transition to net zero, companies can purchase carbon credits while they transition towards net zero to contribute to the beyond value chain mitigation piece. And then at net zero, companies with residual emissions could then purchase carbon credits to balance out the remaining emissions and essentially neutralize them. So hopefully that helps. Great. And if you're interested in this topic, I won't go through this for the sake of time, but we do have an FAQ. This is intended as a live document that will update throughout the process that when we find out more. So the link is in the document, but it answers some of our commonly asked questions. So please check that out. And as I mentioned, it's a live document, so we'll be updating it. So try to go to the website if you're checking it again rather than downloading it. And within that, it shows some of the resources that are useful for companies when they're trying to find out more. And these are just 4 of them. Great. So I'll pass over to Amelie. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. And it's back to me. So I just wanted to go through some of the resources and processes that you need to be aware of. So with the publication of the net zero standard, we have also recently updated our resources to be in line with the new criteria. So here's a link to some of them. Feel free to click on them when we share the slides after this session. But I highly recommend the how-to guide as well as the net zero getting started guide, which I will talk about a bit more in a later slide, as they provide a bit of like a navigational introduction into how to approach, the standard and the criteria. And within the net zero resources, here are the 4 key documents you can take a look at. The first one on the left, getting started guide, is the one that I just mentioned. It also has a checklist of your near-term targets in case you already have them approved, to understand whether you need to update them and what is the next step to get yourself ready for net zero validation. The corporate standard is the full document that provides a lot more detail in the criteria and things to consider, and a bit on the target setting expectations. And then the criteria document is a list of considerations that you would need to think about when you are starting to set your targets. And finally, the NetZero tool is there for you to start. You can use it to calculate, the type of targets that you will need to use in your validation process. And two additional resources that Emma also mentioned. The foundation paper is a good read if you want to understand the technical concepts behind the net zero thinking, our thinking behind net zero. And then the pathways to net zero is another technical document in case you're interested to understand how we interpret the IPCC report and how we have formalized the thinking behind it. So to take the first step on net zero validation, we have the booking system that is already live since our announcement at COP. So we have experienced pretty high demand for these validation slots. And our target validation team is ramping up capacity to ensure that we try to validate as many companies as possible. But in the meantime, you can already take a look at the commitment letter. And once you get it ready, then you can go onto our website to utilize the validation booking system if you want to get started on the journey. And in terms of target submission, for near-term targets, there is currently a booking validation form that you have to fill in, which you will upload through our submission form online. And following which we will ask you to book a date to kind of book your slot for the validation process. And then for net zero, it's a similar process. You will need to make the booking as well, but the net zero booking slot can be for both near and long-term targets as well. And actually within these 2 weeks, we're going to have a more consolidated booking system. So keep an eye out for that. We want to be able to get companies to have one booking for any kind of target validation that you require, and more information will be available if you follow us on LinkedIn, for example. So that's all we have for our presentation. I guess that leaves us with quite a bit of time for Q&A, and I'll hand it over to Chris to kind of direct us to any questions that we have received.
And that's good, we've got a lot of time because we've got a lot of cues. So thank you very much, Emily. Thank you, Emma. That was fantastic. We've really we felt the appetite for this webinar, this series of webinars, really grow significantly the last couple of months. People were really itching to get on this, and you can see it in the questions as well. So we're going to go straight to the questions. Lots around scope 3, and that's kind of where I'm going to begin, and I'll maybe roll some of those together, Emma. The question really is around, with that scope 3 coverage, how do you know the boundaries? How do you know what 100% is in order to give your kind of 67% or so on boundary? So what methodology do you use in order to know your full inventory for scope 3s? That's the first question. The second question linked to that is it all scope 3 categories? Is it categories 1 to 12, or is it just the upstream categories 1 to 5?
I think I can take that question, Emma, but if you have anything else to add, please feel free to do so. So for the purpose of target setting, we ask companies to do at minimum scope 3 screening that covers all of your 15 categories. And that's the best way to identify where your hotspots are. And as mentioned, in terms of near-term targets as well as long-term, for near-term targets, we're asking companies to cover 67% of the entire scope 3 inventory. So, if let's say majority of the targets are concentrated around a certain category, then you can just set a target based on that alone.
And which methodology would you use for that? Is that all necessarily using GHG protocol, full value chain, or yes, can you use others? Okay.
Yeah, so SBT target setting in terms of the baseline for the inventory is based on the greenhouse gas protocol. So for scope 3, there are 15 categories. And actually on the GHG protocol website, there is a scope 3 screening tool which your companies can use to kind of estimate the emissions breakdown of the emissions coming from each category. And of course, this is just for the purpose of setting the targets in the first place. Of course, if companies already have done a bit more on getting better data for their scope 3 emissions, that's even better. And because it's a process to engage your supply chain, your suppliers, to understand where the emissions are coming from and what is the progress each year. So as companies report on their progress towards their targets, we expect that companies will start to get more information, better quality data around scope 3, and hopefully that helps them to also have a better understanding of where those emissions are coming from.
Engagement with suppliers you mentioned, but also engagement with customers, right? Because for your scope 3s, that will be important, especially for some upstream aluminum folks.
Exactly.
In terms of those that shift, I can see there's some people on the questioning piece who are doing their SBT alignment with version 4.2, and they're interested in this kind of transitional period between 4.2 and 5 and the kind of timelines for that. Can you expand a bit on what that process might be? And those already on a 4.2 commitment, what's the expectation for them to transition to that 5? There's a linked question in there which is about organizational changes precipitating a shift in your SBTi targets. So maybe roll those two together, is about that change over time.
So the version 4.2 criteria is going to be kind of like retired after 14 July, which means that companies would only be able to set 1.5 aligned targets after that. So we are still accepting well below 2 degree. When I say well below 2 degree, I mean, mainly for scope 1 and 2 near-term targets until that date. And, as Emma mentioned, if a company is actually looking for net zero validation, then they need to already use a 1.5 degree alignment according to version 5 criteria for their near-term targets. So for companies that are only looking to set near-term targets with version 4.2, as long as they submit their forms through our booking system before 15 July, they can still use version 4.2 criteria.
Okay.
I think, I think the question asked if the booking system was approval for net zero only. So we actually have 2 booking systems. So if you've booked into the net zero booking system for your near-term targets, you actually have to use the separate booking system. And I can send a link to that in the chat now.
Thank you. This precipitated loads more questions, and maybe I'll head some of these off. Anna's asking, what if suppliers change, especially with raw materials and commodities? I'd say, Anna, that's the whole point. That's as you shift to a low carbon supplier, that may be that your suppliers reduce, but it may be that you make material choices. That's part of the process, right? So understanding those emissions is the first piece, and then reducing those down is the second piece. It's linked in, and I guess there is a follow-up question that often those scope 3 emissions have a long tail. There's thousands of data points, and how do you reduce those down? Is SBT looking at tools for that? I know there are tools coming from, let's say, International Aluminium Institute looking at scope 3 for primary aluminium production, but are there any tools out there that you have or that your collaborators have that enable people to reduce down those huge scope 3 tail to something a bit more manageable?
I don't know if Emma wants to feed into this, but in terms of, I think scope 3, the key thing is, collecting that data, right? So a lot of companies that have set scope 3 targets actually use CDP supply chain program or a similar program or framework, to ask their suppliers to attribute emissions to themselves, therefore, collecting the data in a very structured format, and that helps to understand, the total emissions calculation each year. And the question earlier about what if your, suppliers change, that shouldn't affect your target progression, especially if you have, even for customer engagement targets, for example, the target itself is structured in a way that, between your base year and your target year, the number of suppliers, or the percentage of suppliers who have set science-based targets needs to meet a certain percentage. So it's not just looking, it's not really looking at specific suppliers, but overall, how many of them have set the targets.
And I think that, that comes to this engagement piece, right? Anna's kind of come back and said, well, we're limited in that, but that engagement will drive that. For aluminium, of course, for primary aluminum anyway, 2/3 of our supply is fossil fuel based. It takes time for that to transition. There is a limited volume of low carbon or recycled material available in the market today. That is a fact. But driving improvement is where we're heading towards. And that maybe lets me kind of come in here with some aluminum specificities, which is that we, in our new standard released later this year, are looking for all entities certified under ASI, under performance standard, to have 1.5 degree aligned pathways and plans and targets to meet those waypoints. So we want the emissions kind of in, and then we want to drive them down. The question is, what methods does one use to do that? And at the moment, we're a little bit loose in that. We say ASI endorsed methods, but clearly the net zero standard could and likely will be one of those where you can actually use SBTi's method to demonstrate long-term reductions in line with 1.5. One other element, though, is this sectoral decarbonisation approach, these kind of sector-specific guidance. And you mentioned to me just before we came on air about the aluminum guidance, and I wonder if there's something you can say about the development of those sector-specific guidances, because there's a couple of questions come in as well about whether SBT tools are for entities, for companies, or indeed sector-wide. So that interplay, I'd be interested in how SBT deals with that.
Yeah, so the work around developing a sectoral decarbonization approach for your sector is still in progress, but that shouldn't stop companies from setting targets already. Indeed, we see a lot of companies already using the absolute contraction approach that is more like a linear annual reduction. And because this what we call cross-sector approach is actually applicable to all sectors except for power sector and oil and gas. So, of course, having a sector-specific guidance will help maybe to have more clarity on what are the considerations within the sector. But until that is available, companies in the aluminum sector can already set your targets. Yeah.
And that, we can see some of this, it's fast moving. We talked about this at the beginning, right? This fact that this is really developing quickly. One of the things we're looking to do is to update our guidance much more frequently than the current kind of 3 to 5 year turnaround. The IAI, International Aluminium Institute, released their 1.5 degree pathway for the sector as a whole in November. And actually, we have a project this year to incorporate that into some kind of sectoral decarbonisation approach. The current SDA for aluminium is 2 degree or beyond 2 degree. So it's to incorporate that 1.5, thus giving companies that SDA for aluminum that they can use. But as you say, Emily, of course, absolute contraction is in there. You can use these existing pieces. It's sector neutral, right?
Sorry, Emma wanted to say something.
Well, I think Chris kind of answered my question, but I did speak to our technical working group just in advance of this about the aluminium project, and we were just curious to know whether, we've completed a scoping phase of that work, but it hasn't progressed any further. But we were just curious to know, would it be helpful for us to continue that work? Is that something that companies within the sector are really kind of itching for, and is it holding people back, or is it something that we can, or companies are happy to go away with, the general methods? So just kind of maybe a question back to the group.
Well, I can answer that. I'll tell you now. It's linked to a question that came in, which is why are so few primary aluminium companies, I think, why are so few of those companies setting science-based targets? And the truth is they don't have the tools that have that specificity around, especially for smelting, the huge energetic, the power component of that, and the fact that often that is not bought from, bought on spot from the grid. Like, you know, they're not a Microsoft, they're not a Walmart. That kind of power really dominates their emissions. So some kind of tailored method for the aluminum sector is being looked for. Indeed, that's something that we're already in discussion with others about as well. So we will need that in our guidance documents. That's not to say that it negates the possibility of using other methods, but I think the aluminum sector in particular is looking for those specific methods. And that links again to a question that's come in, which is around the role of recycling. And that you know, for us, those different routes are actually quite separate. You know, what a primary sector is going to do is very different from the recycling folks, and understanding that impact of recycling is important too. I think the question that's come in is far too detailed for the 10 minutes we have left, but maybe I would say that it is about your emissions inventory. And if you're looking, it's SBTi's work is not about, I'm putting words in your mouth here, about avoided emissions, right? It doesn't take into account those avoided emissions piece. Those avoided emissions for recycling, you can kind of do elsewhere. This is about the emissions of your value chain, and with the beyond value chain mitigation, what you can do beyond that in year 2050. Talking of beyond value chain mitigations, there are a few questions on what kind of counts. Maybe I'll take those one at a time. There's got, I guess, a question quite simply at the beginning was whether carbon capture, you know, counts as permanent storage. Maybe linked to that, or permanence of removal, sorry. Linked to that is the question about whether carbon capture, utilization and storage is seen as a mitigation piece, whether it's a reduction of the line above or it's a removals piece, a reduction of the line below. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about CCUS, important for the aluminum sector.
Yeah, great. So anything that kind of stops emissions coming out into the atmosphere and is within your value chain, so the CCUS, that would be included within your science-based target. So that, yeah, that fits within the science-based target. The emissions aren't actually, you know, reaching the atmosphere, and therefore that's, you know, a reduction as opposed to what was happening previously. And then the first question was about whether carbon, was it direct air capture and storage? Which one? Sorry.
Yes, so that's good. So the direct air capture would be seen as the below, right? This is CCUS for the aluminum sector, is it would essentially be on, let's say, the power generator, gas-fired turbines, let's say, for power generation within your own scope. So that's within your value chain, yeah.
Yeah, and then if it was a technology like direct air capture, which is actually taking the carbon out of the atmosphere and then storing it permanently, then that would count as your beyond value chain mitigation, or the neutralization piece. Or if it's in your value chain, you happen to have that technology within your value chain, it would also count as the neutralization piece. That is kind of that, although I said, you know, earlier that the frameworks for understanding what removals are permanent, direct air capture and storage is one of those kind of safe bets. That's, yep, you know, very, very certain that that's going to be part of that neutralization piece. So that's a good place to kind of focus, you know, any investments that you were looking to do, or things like that.
Great. Thank you. There's another question on offsets on beyond value chain mitigation, the quality of offsets within that. I think you touched on that a little bit earlier, but maybe you could expand on that quality of offset and where the threshold is for quality, right?
Yeah. So again, this is kind of somewhere where we are continuing our work. I think what we want to encourage is the highest quality possible, and there are some really good frameworks out there that companies can use, like Gold Standard, Vera, that type of thing, if you're looking for carbon credits. As I mentioned, we do have that Beyond Value Chain Mitigation FAQ, and within that we point to quite a few ones that are seen as really credible in the space. So there's a list of them. Again, like the Leaf Coalition, that's a good place to look as well. And then if you want to do kind of more reading about what makes a credible offset, there's the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative paper. That's really, really in-depth and detailed if you want to read 100 pages. Or there's also offsetguide.org, and they've got quite a handy PDF and also, you know, a clickable website that you can have a look at different topics. So those are some good resources if you're interested.
Great, thank you. I'm getting there's an interesting flow, I think, in the Q&A, which is this difference between kind of near term and long term, and SBT, which is kind of now understood to move from 4.2 to 5 and a 1.5 degree aligned science-based target with the incorporation of scope 3. And then the long-term net zero, where I think there is feels like there's discomfort with some of that uncertainty and actually being able to set those concrete targets. Do you feel that as well? Right? I mean, you know, as these standards are developed, is that kind of part of the process and it's a kind of learning piece? And if so, what's that relative weight of a near-term science-based targets that's a bit more concrete, hard to achieve, but concrete, and a long-term aim or ambition, which is very amorphous and at the moment a little bit fluffy?
Yeah, we definitely feel that. And I mentioned in the summer, we did a road test with 84 companies. And what we found throughout that process was that there were some companies, there seemed to be a kind of two camps of companies in terms of, you know, discomfort with the lack of clarity, you know, the fact that they don't even know what's happening within the business in the next, you know, perhaps even 5 years. There was a difference between companies also that were perhaps, you know, really, really old. So companies that have been around for say like 100, 200 years, they certainly wanted to be around for the next 30 years. So they had one attitude, and like some newer companies that, you know, everything changes so quickly. So how can we wrap our heads around that? And there is, we had some support throughout that road testing process from BCG, and they've written an article about it. It's super interesting about the difference in approaches that companies were taking within their sustainability teams. And what they found was that there tended to be some attitudes to kind of, there was one attitude which was very practical, and how can we do this? We know, you know, quite vaguely perhaps what's happening in the next 10 years and the technologies, but we certainly don't know what's happening in 2050. How can we wrap our heads around that? Then there are some other companies that said, look, we know we need to get here. We can start it off by, you know, having that intention and then figuring out afterwards. So there are different, and I think within that article, they suggested some, you know, different approaches to take within those companies on how to kind of move things forward. I'll try and find it and send it in the link, but it's 100% a challenge that we are dealing with. And I think, you know, it happened at the beginning of science-based targets as well. It was difficult for people to wrap their heads around, and, you know, that level of ambition. But over time, you know, the companies will see peers doing it, and then it becomes more normal. But it will be a learning curve, 100%.
So, and as you know, I can see that expansion out along the value chain. The value chain is extremely important here. I think that's something to kind of get in everyone's mind, is that expansion for scope 3 is you talking about that full supply chain and a need for engagement all the way along. For aluminium, for instance, we're 1.1 billion ton CO2 emitter. We're going to need to come down to 50 million tons by mid-century across that full value chain, including the recycling piece. And we can't get there with a bit of efficiency and some increased scrap alone. It's kind of full structural change needs to happen. But within your membership, within the membership of SBTi, and broadly with the emissions represented by SBTi's membership and those signing up for targets, is that representative of the full value chain, or are you seeing some parts of the value chain come in and others being left out? Are you being dominated? You may not have the data to hand by let's say downstream entities with low scope 1s and 2s but high scope 3s, or are you seeing significant commodity companies coming in? What's that share among the membership and those setting targets along that value chain? Sorry to throw that one in there at the last.
Emily, do you want to take this one? All right.
Yeah, I guess I can give a bit of background on so far what we have seen. I don't have the exact numbers, but I do see a lot of companies in the construction material sector, for example, as well as real estate companies, so kind of like across, different parts of the value chain that have set targets. For example, we are seeing a lot more interest in financial institutions who are trying to set targets as well. And for those, their scope 3 emissions are 700 times, their own operational emissions. So, I think typically, we hope that the higher emitting sectors will come in and start setting targets as well. But I think we have a pretty good adoption rate of companies up and down the value chain, I would say. And with the flag guidance that is being piloted just yesterday, I think we're going to see more commodity companies that are joining, in this target setting process, because especially in developing economies like Latin America and Asia, a lot of companies are actually falling into these, land use and agriculture sector. And we have seen a lot of interest in that as well already.
Great. We're certainly talking more to financial institutions. You'll see some of that this year as well. Linked to that, one final question, which is there a Chinese version of SBTi or the SBTi standards given China's inventory?
I know that WWF has a Chinese version of the target setting steps, and I think some of the materials as well. With the net zero documents, there hasn't yet been a plan to kind of translate that yet. But if there is a demand, then if there's a demand and we find the resources to do it, then definitely we can do that. But already there is a Japanese translation of the version 5 criteria and the net zero criteria on the resources page. So that's already available. And for sure, if there is enough demand for other languages, we would look into that as well.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much, Emily. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We have a whole load more questions that have come in. I think we'll get to some of those in this afternoon's webinar as well. But I know there's a real appetite for people to get in touch directly as well. So I think we, as mentioned before, we'll share a recording of this webinar as well as the slides used, and also Amelie and Emma's contact details as well. But there's a booking system, there's a formalized system as well. So use that, but do take advantage of Amelie and Emma's knowledge too. And also be aware that we will be working on the Aluminium piece as well throughout this year too. So it would be great to catch up later on in the year and see how some of that's going as well. So with that, it just leaves me to thank Amelie and Emma for presenting and answering your questions today. Thanks very much for participating in this much demanded webinar. I really appreciate it. So thank you all. Thank you both very much. Thanks very much, Paulina. Questions are starting to come in. What we had this morning was a whole flood. So I'm going to give a couple of minutes for that to happen, and also for you to take a drink and get your voice back a little bit, and maybe to tell some of the attendees about the relationship that we have with Science-Based Targets Initiative within ASI, and the work that we're looking to do to get science-based target SBTi processes within the guidance for ASI. So people will see at the moment there's reference to science-based targets and indeed the net zero standard in the current draft of our performance standard guidance. We're currently in the middle of consultation on that, so do take a look, have a look at some of those linkages, and we'll be trying to incorporate further work into the guidance as we move forward. So what Paulina was talking about today on the beyond value chain mitigation work is very important historically there's been this talk about offsets and how they're used within 1.5 degree pathway that we reference in our standard. And so as that solidifies, I think we're going to be able to pull that into our guidance a lot more. This morning, there were lots of questions around aluminium specific methodologies. And I know that there are other sectoral guidance available under SBTi, and the discussion this morning was, when are we going to get an aluminum one? So I won't ask you that, Paulina. Folks can see the written answer to that soon, but we at ASI are certainly keen to have that, and we'll be developing something ourselves based on the IAI's 1.5 degree scenario anyway. As this morning, scope 3 has featured, and I guess this morning's question was about how do I get hold of especially for downstream people, how do I get hold of all that information on my many suppliers? This afternoon's question is more about asking for best practices in doing that. Is that something that's within SBTi's kind of work plan to come up with best practice for how one builds a scope 3 inventory and engages with their suppliers and customers?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. Scope 3, it's a huge issue. Currently, anything inventory related, first of all, we reference the GHG protocol. So for anything in that term, always use the GHG protocol for your accounting. We are also working on having a supply chain engagement, for lack of a better word, package to kind of help companies and guide them a little bit in that, and how to give your companies, or how to work with your supply chain, and getting and being able to track emissions, tackle emissions, and reduce those emissions. So do look out for our supply chain work. And then the final piece is really our next step of the project, which is on scope 3. And so yeah, we do anticipate to provide more kind of guidance around scope 3, but we don't really provide recommendations for who to go to for that. We do recognize that it is a really big problem, and that is why we're also giving a little bit of time between near-term targets and long-term targets, and in order for companies to work with their supply chain, work with other companies in their industries to better tackle those emissions. But we don't point to specific technologies or practices for companies to use.
I mean, there are mechanisms, right? If people are when you're reviewing out there, people, the latest draft performance standard, take a look at the chain of custody standard, which is also going through public consultation now. And they're under criteria 9.3, which is optional. We're asking COC certified entities to include carbon footprint for the ship data that includes scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 categories 1, 3, and 4. So kind of true cradle to gate at each point in the chain. Now that's optional right now, but that way of having data flow along specific value chains, supply chains, is something that we as a certification body can start to nudge people towards. Secondarily, I know there's some work going on within the International Aluminium Institute to come up with kind of scope 3 default factors for the aluminium sector, given that there are some points in the process which are very high emitting. So you can really get a fair old chunk of your scope 3s if you can get hold of those processes for a downstream company. There's one question though, Paulina, it's not been asked here, but it came this morning, and that's what does scope 3 here mean? Is it true scope 3 categories 1 to 12, or is it just upstream scope 3s, or is it, what's the scope for scope 3?
Yeah, no, it's all of scope 3. So I guess currently for your near-term targets, right, you can base it off of where most of your emissions come from. So right now, for your near-term, you're only having a scope 3 target if over 40% of your emissions come from that, and then you only have your target covering 67% of that, but you still do need to, do a full inventory of your scope 3.
And that's, you know, for folks who are on here now, a broad piece of our membership is in the downstream side. Of course, they will have scope 3s dominating on the upstream side, but we have high variability in the carbon footprints of the primary producers too, right? So there is that understanding your sourcing of materials is going to be very important, but also who your customers are. For a bauxite miner who is supplying to a coal-fired aluminium smelter or alumina to a coal-fired aluminium smelter, that's going to be important to understand that and build that into your inventory. There's some couple of actually there is this question on scope 1. How is the manufacturer's scope 1 baseline established for measuring future reductions? So I guess that's what year does one use to set the baseline, and how do they set that? I'm guessing methodologically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can set it as far back as 2015, but we do recommend to use the year with like the most up-to-date data. And then you do have your targets. Your target starts the date of the year of submission. So that 5 to 10 years starts from that, but your baseline can be further back.
Do you have anything in place to take account of the fact that COVID, 2019, 2020 were kind of funky years, the use of those for baseline setting?
Yeah, we do have like a caveat for that. So just
okay.
to since of course 2019 data is very different from other years, so kind of using something else in place of that. But yes, definitely. And then in terms of baseline, also if your company were to go through any change in structure or acquisition or something, we do ask if you already have a target to re-baseline, to make sure that the baseline that you've chosen is representative of the new data that you have.
So that was a question actually from this morning, was about organizational changes, and that's quite well articulated in the GHG protocol, I think. Is that kind of the same that you use, or is there something else that triggers organizational, what's the threshold for an organizational change?
Yeah, no, I mean, we do follow that, and then there is a percentage, and it's somewhere between 5 and 20%. I can get back to you on that one, but we don't currently have a criteria for that. So it is kind of up to the companies right now as to what you consider to be a restructure. I mean, of course, if you're acquiring a very, very large company, then obviously there should be some change there, but we are starting to outline a little bit more to have our own perspective on what we consider a triggering for a new target and a rebaseline.
Actually, so that kind of raises, so that's a question from me. I'm going to ignore the ones that come in there now. But the is what, it's corporate accounting, right? So based on the GHG protocol, it's you're scoping the corporate emissions inventory. It's not product based, it is that corporate entity. Now for us within ASI, we have a difference between your membership, so that's the kind of membership company, and then your self-scoped entity, which actually can be any shape you like within reason. How does that sit within SBTi as a kind of signatory company, a corporate entity? Do you have to have the target for the whole of that entity, or can you do it for a subset of the corporation?
Yeah, no, it should be the whole company. So okay. We do want kind of to come from a parent company perspective. It can't really just be a subgroup. Okay,
thank you. With the version 4.2 and version 5 coming out this year, are companies required to submit? Let me read this verbatim. When the version 5 comes out, will companies be required to submit SBTi approved near-term targets against 5 or 4?
Okay, that's a great question. So essentially, the version 5 is released. You can look at that now, and you can already align your targets to that standard. If you're looking to set a net zero standard, you do need to use version 5, effective right away, because that's the only way you'll get approval of the net zero target. If, however, you're not ready to set a net zero target, and you would still like to use version 4.2, you can do so up until July 15th. And then that's when we have a cutoff basically to version 5. Of course, we recognize that, our booking system is very booked. And so so basically what we're saying is that if you submit your targets before July 15th, then we will still be able to validate that. Eventually we'll have to cut that off as well, since we won't be able to do too many of those historical ones. But yes, if you submit your target in line with 4.2 before July 15th, then that will still count.
Okay, great. So that goes to the question that's come in as well about booking systems, that there are two separate booking systems for those two pieces, right? One net zero, but you have to do both near term and long term. Just near term up to July against version 4 or version 5 is your choice.
Yeah, right. So, and if you don't have if you don't have a near term target yet, then just book through NetZero, and want a NetZero target, just book through the NetZero validation booking system. And if you want just near term, then use near term.
Okay, thank you. There's a question, Christophe Busmar, Nespresso, how can an aluminium producer know it's downstream scope 3? So yes, we've talked about this flow of information along the value chain, and there's certainly the questions raised by downstream about multiple, often thousands of suppliers and supply chains. How do they get hold of that tail? But indeed the opposite is also true. How does the producer know, its scope 3 the boundaries of its scope 3, the 6 to 12 rather than categories 1 to 5? This is a big question, right, Paulina? I guess you're not going to answer it.
It's a big question. I don't think I will be able to give you kind of a satisfying answer, because we redirect to the GHG protocol. So I would use that in terms of all of your accounting methods, and go through those resources. And then once we do have supply chain engagement work and some more scope 3 work, hopefully that should provide some more details for you to be able to come up with those numbers, and engage those numbers too.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I would just look for those in the coming months. Once there's a timeline, that's something that will be on our website, but I can't tell you concretely now when that will be available.
I mean, for us in aluminum, I've got to say it's probably easier than most for that upstream bit, right? We know that that we don't have co-products. We know the kind of boundaries of processes from mining through to semi-fabrication, including recycling streams, and they're pretty linear, and the processes are pretty common for all. So you can do some, you can get an idea as long as you know that the smelting is in there, and that's your variability. It's that post semis that's the issue. It's that when it stops being the aluminium sector and starts being, the packaging or the automotive segment, and how allocation happens within those. And that's maybe an interesting place to look in the future about how these sectors, these kind of sectoral guidances come together. You mentioned that there's ones for cities or the built environment, is that right? And
yeah, we have a number already available, so apparel might not be as useful here. We have a public consultation for all flag emissions, so forestry, land use, and agriculture. The power sector guidance is available, so you can use that today too. So I'm sure that's applicable as well, for the power of your facilities. Then we are now this year working. Well, we also have some transportation and aviation guidance out, and we have an industrial team basically now working on specific guidances for the built environment, for cement, and for steel. So these are 3 that are going to be coming out before the end of the year. And all of our guidances will be also updated to have 1.5 C scenarios as well, if they currently don't have them. So currently on the aluminum side, we've done a scoping project. So the results of that project is available on our website in the aluminum sector page. We don't currently have a project to develop that guidance and those methodologies any further at the moment, but that may be something that becomes that may happen in the next few years.
Well, what's what's happened since that report, and we linked to that this morning. So I think we will put that in the answers to the questions so people can see that report that's gone up there, is that now we have a 1.5 degree sectoral pathway for the aluminium sector developed by International Aluminium Institute, released in November last year. So that's a kind of a true sector-wide pathway, including the recycling flows, semi-fabrication flows as well. That is aligned with IEA's NZE scenario. So it's a 1.5 sector-wide pathway that's looking for a place to live, and and understanding how individual entities within that sectoral slope, how they can contribute to net zero is the next step. So that's kind of what we're looking for in the next year, is how do you go from sector-wide, albeit with different slopes for the primary industry and the recycling industry and the downstream industry, how do you go from that to what individual entities need to do? And I think that's the linkage with SBTi's work, both broad SBTs, but also net zero as well. There's a question that's come in on scope 2. I'm surprised the question on scope 2, I'll be honest with you, because I thought these kind of discussions had been had. I thought we were into scope 3, but this question is around the fact that scope 2 emissions aren't directly in the control of aluminium producers. I'll caveat this by saying that 2/3 of aluminium power generation is in the control of producers. So only 1/3 of aluminium supply comes from scope 2 grids. How are goals credibly established for scope 2 emissions? I'm going to maybe turn this question around, Paulina, and say, how are there some examples from how other sectors have used these kind of targets to influence their power suppliers or scope 2 suppliers elsewhere, or even made power purchasing decisions based on their target setting?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of a specific example here. But yeah, but that definitely is something that we're seeing more and more of, right? Is that companies are now going to their power suppliers and requesting this or moving somewhere else based on the regulations of their area. So these are changes that we are seeing already, whether it's between states or between countries, and so there is a lot of pressure from the company side, from the industrial, especially in like heavy industrials, happening in those areas. First coming from very, very large companies, of course, that are building their own power plants at this renewable plants, and so I do see that change continuing on, but it's definitely starting to spread. It's spreading in very different ways. It's spreading among power producers. It's similar for scope 3 in terms of it's spreading to your supply chain, because companies will start looking for other suppliers or different sources of things. It's also working in the opposite effect, where the investors are also looking to their companies to change things. So I think it's just this massive disbursement from different corners. So I would say it doesn't just apply to the scope 2, but from all aspects of the scopes and the various categories of scopes.
What I'm hearing from is investors, right? You're going to want to decarbonize your facility. You're going to need billions of dollars to do that. What will lenders want? They will want to see that you are decarbonizing, right? So you will have to. You're gonna have to do it. So, in order to get the capital to realize these reductions. I mean, interestingly, what we'll see from the aluminum perspective is that 2/3 that is currently self-generated, predominantly fossil fueled. Actually, this is what the IAI data show, the IAI scenarios show, is that they will grid connect. So actually, you'll go from a scope 1 power generation, almost increasing your scope 2s as you grid connect, but those grids themselves will decarbonize in line with an IEA approach. And there's some interesting stuff, right? Aluminium, historically, the primary industry was a baseload consumer, so it led to the development of grids. And in the future, actually, the primary industry anyway, could even operate as a modulator of renewable heavy grids as well. So there's a role for the sector to play in how those grids develop. It's not just all about taking. Technological, there's some technology questions this morning. It's about the permanent removals of CO2 besides CCU and CCS. So I guess this atmospheric capture and storage, these kind of technologies that you will be allowed to use to compensate in 2050. I know I'm using the wrong language there, but which you kind of won't in the meantime. It's that bit that you apply at the end. What are those technological avenues, even if they're not fully developed yet?
Yeah, I mean, that many of them aren't fully developed. And so that is, of course, something that needs to be incentivized along the way. We do need to put a lot of investment into those technologies today in order to see those actual technologies and the mitigation activities materialize. We don't currently have a set of criteria of what these technologies should or will look like. That's also just because the space is evolving, and we'll probably see more technologies or materialize, but also the pricing of those technologies evolve over time. So we will be providing, I think, a little bit more around what we mean by permanent storage, but currently what we're just saying is it has to be permanently stored, but we don't yet have that criteria. This is something that we'll look into a little bit more when we are thinking through the beyond the value chain mitigation work and neutralization work. So first we'll think through, okay, neutralization, what is a quality carbon storage thing, and what is and then how the other pieces then outside of your value chain, what should that look like? So yeah, we don't have a concrete answer on that yet. It's a very nascent, evolving space, but also a lot of exciting things to do. I think one thing that's worth mentioning is that in terms of the scenarios that we use in order to develop the pathways and the methodologies and guidance, we do anticipate that these technologies, will be available and used, but it's also a relatively conservative amount so we're trying to not over rely on these new technologies, but also saying that we will need these technologies. Of course, we need the reductions as much as we can, but of course there will be residual emissions. So we will need to, at some point, need technologies to do that. So the underlying science is aware of that what we're basing this on.
Is that the IEA? Is it the IEA slopes that you use to do
Yeah,
that?
we use IEA for net zero, and then a number of other ones. And so that's why I would refer to the Pathways to Net Zero report that I alluded to earlier. It's on our website, and that also gives a little bit more detail on that. I think the next slide here has.
See, this is good stuff. You should have got to this earlier. Are these included on this? Are these on the slides that we can put on the website? Use the appendix ones, right?
Yeah, this is the appendix. So I was anticipating something like this coming up. So, but it depends kind of on what the questions are. But essentially, you can get a little bit more detail in that report on how we determine residual emissions, but and what reports we use to do that. But yes, the IEA net zero emission scenario is one that we rely very heavily on, but there are some differences as well.
Yeah, they don't have non-CO2, do they? That's a big, that's a big thing. I heard you say that earlier on. Your 55 gigatons is CO2 equivalent. It's not just the 30 gigatons of CO2. It includes methane and SF6 and the non-CO2 gases in there too, which indeed the IAI 1.5 does too. Historically, aluminium sector had more of those. With the PFC emissions today, we're dominated by CO2, essentially. There is a question that's come in. I'm going to change it slightly. It's about this experience on the step from 1.5 degree to a net zero scenario. I'm going to shift that slightly and include a question that came this morning, which was, can you, in layperson's terms, tell what the difference is between net zero and carbon neutrality. I'll maybe ask you all three of those: 1.5, net zero, carbon neutrality, and then I'll have a little bit to say on the aluminum sector impact of that.
Yeah, yes, definitely. So the 1.5 question, sorry, do you mind just repeating
It's a
that?
what's the difference between 1.5 degree scenario and a net zero scenario?
Okay, yeah, right. Yeah, so I mean, net zero is the end point. So this is what we're trying to limit global temperature rise to. We don't want it to exceed 1.5 C. We're already at around 1 degree C. So basically the rest of our carbon budget to get to just 1.5 degrees Celsius determines that slope for us to get to a point of net zero, of where we're basically human emissions, greenhouse gas emissions are equal to the amount that are being removed. So the 1.5 C scenario is then that slope to stay within that carbon budget. And the net zero point is making sure that we are reducing as much as we're emitting at that endpoint.
And that's across all economy. That's the global wide net
picture.
Zero. Yep.
Yeah. That's the global picture. And then I guess if you then shift to what the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality is, and this is, we're not validating any carbon neutrality claims within the SBTi. We're just focused on net zero because the SBTi focuses on emission abatement and reductions.
Yes.
Basically the mitigation hierarchy that we were looking at. But carbon neutrality is it's similar in turn, but it just doesn't require the steep reduction, right? So it basically means that you're still using offsetting to reach your target, and then you're carbon neutral. And then for net zero, though, it means basically that you're neutralizing only the residual emissions that are left. Carbon neutrality, we could all be carbon neutral, but that wouldn't work on a planetary scale, and we wouldn't be able to get to net zero on a planetary scale with just carbon neutrality. And that's for many different reasons, because that wouldn't lead to the reductions necessary to keep within our remaining carbon budget. Essentially, we also don't have kind of the global capacity in terms of land, technology, etc., for everyone to offset and for everyone to reduce with technologies. So that's why there's kind of that difference. Carbon neutrality includes offsetting. We don't allow for not offsetting within the SBTi. So we're basically making sure that all net zero targets do not have offsetting on that there. But we're still saying we're encouraging you to do that.
And that's great. The focus on abatement is get your numbers down on the top, right? Residual emissions at the end through removals, a small amount compared to your abatement reduction, and then beyond value chain mitigation is that kind of additional aspect as we go towards that mid-century. It's going to be interesting to see how recycling and things play into that. I think that's a discussion that our members will be interested in, how recycling is part of that beyond value chain mitigation, given that you can't have it within your abatement slope. For the aluminum sector, that work by III says that by 2050, the emissions of the sector aren't at zero, they're actually at 50 million tons, which compared to today's 1.1 billion tons is a 95+% reduction. But there is still the residual mid-century. That's because IEA give the power sector, they make the power sector do the removals for other people. So a 1.5 degree slope for the aluminium sector isn't actually zero for us alone mid-century, but it is net zero for the economy wide, and the fact that aluminium contributes to savings elsewhere. So in answer to the question that's come in, I'd say take a look at the IAI slopes, because they articulate what 1.5 means for aluminium. The big question then, though, is what does that mean for net zero target setting for individual entities? And I think that's the work to come this year, and that's certainly what our entities are looking for us at ASI to deliver through our guidance. Look, we've used more than our 45 minutes. We've got to 1 hour. We did that this morning as well. And I think that's about where we're going to wrap it up today. So Thank you very much, Paulina, for your presentation and for actively answering so many of these questions. Really appreciate it. And also, please pass on our thanks to Amelie and Emma for this morning's webinar as well. Thank you very much.